In 1843, a woman named Catherine Hartley wrote a letter to her sister in Massachusetts, describing her life on her husband's Alabama plantation as living in a prison where I am both jailer and prisoner, surrounded by 200 souls whose bondage sustains my comfort while their suffering destroys my peace. Catherine had married plantation owner Thomas Hartley in 1835 when she was 22 years old, moving from her family's modest home in Boston to a sprawling cotton plantation that operated through the forced labor of 187 enslaved people. For 8 years, Catherine had tried to reconcile her northern upbringing that had taught her slavery was wrong with her role as plantation mistress that required her to manage enslaved household workers and to maintain the domestic sphere that depended on their labor. But by 1843, Catherine had reached a breaking point where she could no longer maintain the illusions that had allowed her to function in her role, where she understood that she was trapped in a system she found morally repugnant, but that she had no power to escape or to change, and where she recognized that her own limited oppression as a woman without legal rights or economic independence was intertwined with, but incomparable to the absolute bondage that enslaved people experienced. Before we descend into Catherine's story and what it revealed about white women's complicity in and resistance to slavery, hit that subscribe button right now. Smash the notification bell and drop your state in the comments below. This is Epoch of Fear, where we explore the moral compromises that slavery demanded from everyone who participated in it. Catherine Foster was born in 1813 in Boston, Massachusetts, to a family of modest merchants who were not wealthy, but who were comfortable and who held generally anti-slavery views that were common among middle-class Northerners in the early 19th century. Catherine's education emphasized moral improvement, Christian duty, and the domestic virtues appropriate for young women of her class. She was taught that slavery was a Southern problem that Northerners should disapprove of, but that was not their direct responsibility since they did not own slaves themselves. When Catherine met Thomas Hartley in 1834 during his business trip to Boston, she was attracted to his apparent refinement, his economic success, and his assurances that he treated his enslaved workers humanely, and that slavery in his household was nothing like the brutal practices that abolitionists described. Thomas courted Catherine with promises that she would have authority over the household, that she would be able to influence how enslaved people were treated, and that her moral presence would make the plantation a Christian and benevolent place, despite being built on slavery's foundation. Catherine believed these promises partly because she wanted to marry, and partly because Thomas represented economic security and social status that her family could not provide. The reality that Catherine encountered when she arrived at Hartley Plantation in Alabama in 1835 immediately contradicted everything Thomas had promised about humane treatment and about her ability to influence conditions. The plantation consisted of approximately 3,000 acres, worked by 187 enslaved people who labored in cotton fields from dawn until dark under supervision of brutal overseers, who used whips and threats to enforce discipline and productivity. The enslaved people lived in crude cabins with dirt floors, received minimal food and clothing, had no medical care beyond what they could provide for themselves, and were subject to arbitrary punishment, including whipping, isolation, and sail away from families if they showed any resistance or failed to meet work quotas. Catherine's household staff consisted of 15 enslaved women and children, who cooked, cleaned, cared for Catherine's eventual children, and performed all domestic labor while receiving barely adequate food, no wages, and constant surveillance to prevent theft or resistance. Within weeks of her arrival, Catherine witnessed enslaved people being whipped for minor infractions, saw families separated when Thomas sold individuals to raise cash, and understood that her husband's claims about benevolent treatment were complete lies designed to make her complicit in a system she would have rejected if she had known its true nature before marriage. Catherine's initial response to discovering the reality of plantation slavery was to attempt small interventions that might reduce suffering without directly challenging Thomas's authority or the fundamental system. She tried to provide better food to household servants by giving them leftovers from family meals. She attempted to teach enslaved children basic literacy, despite laws prohibiting such education, conducting secret lessons that were stopped when Thomas discovered them, and threatened to sell the children if Catherine continued. She interceded occasionally when Thomas or overseers planned particularly harsh punishments, appealing to Christian mercy, though such appeals were rarely successful. And she provided basic medical care to sick or injured enslaved people, using her limited knowledge of home remedies and nursing. These small acts of kindness were Catherine's attempt to maintain some sense of moral agency and to convince herself that she was not fully complicit in slavery's violence, but they were also inadequate responses that did not fundamentally challenge the system, and that may have made the system more bearable and thus more sustainable by providing just enough relief to prevent total despair or rebellion. The power dynamics within Catherine's marriage demonstrated how patriarchal authority and slavery reinforced each other to control both white women and enslaved people. Catherine had no legal rights to property, no independent income, no ability to leave the marriage without facing complete social and economic ruin, and no authority to make decisions about plantation operations or about how enslaved people were treated, despite her nominal role as household manager. Thomas controlled all finances, made all important decisions, and could override any of Catherine's preferences about household management or about treatment of enslaved people. When Catherine expressed moral objections to slavery or to specific acts of cruelty, Thomas responded by asserting his absolute authority as husband and master, by dismissing her concerns as female emotionalism that did not understand business necessities, and by threatening that if she created problems by questioning his management, he would send her back to Boston in disgrace while keeping their children. This threat was credible because law gave fathers complete custody rights, and because a woman who left her husband would be socially ruined and would have no means of supporting herself. Catherine was trapped in the marriage, just as enslaved people were trapped in bondage, though her confinement was incomparably less brutal and allowed far more privileges and autonomy than enslaved people ever experienced. The birth of Catherine's 4 children between 1836 and 1842 complicated her moral position because she wanted to protect her children from knowledge of slavery's violence while also not wanting to raise them to become the kind of slaveholders who inflicted such violence without moral qualms. Catherine tried to shield her children from witnessing whippings and from seeing the worst aspects of how the plantation operated, but this shielding required accepting that such violence continued and that her children would eventually learn about it and would probably accept it as normal. She tried to teach her children Christian values about treating all people with kindness and respect, but these teachings were contradicted by the daily reality that enslaved people in their household were treated as property rather than as people with rights or dignity. She watched with horror as her oldest son began imitating his father's attitudes toward enslaved people, treating them with casual cruelty and referring to them with degrading language that Catherine had tried to prevent him from learning. The failure to raise children who would reject slavery despite her attempts to instill different values demonstrated how thoroughly the system corrupted everyone who lived within it, and how even well-intentioned efforts at moral education were overwhelmed by the normalization of violence and dehumanization. Catherine's 1843 letter to her sister that described feeling trapped was written during a personal crisis when several events had forced her to confront the impossibility of maintaining moral purity while participating in slavery. In early 1843, Thomas had sold a young enslaved woman named Sarah, who had worked in the household for years, selling her to a trader heading to the deep south, despite Sarah having a young child who would be left behind. Catherine had begged Thomas not to separate mother and child, but Thomas insisted the sale was necessary to raise cash and that Catherine had no right to interfere with his business decisions. Catherine watched Sarah being taken away in chains while her toddler screamed and reached for her mother, and Catherine realized that her presence at the plantation and her small acts of kindness meant nothing if she could not prevent such fundamental cruelty. Shortly after this incident, Catherine discovered that Thomas had been sexually exploiting several enslaved women on the plantation, fathering children with them, while maintaining the fiction of being a faithful Christian husband. The combination of witnessing family separation and discovering sexual violence shattered whatever remaining illusions Catherine had about the plantation being manageable or about her role being anything other than complicit participation in systematic evil. The letter Catherine wrote was remarkable for its honesty about her own position and about the moral impossibility of being a slaveholding plantation mistress while maintaining any genuine Christian faith or moral integrity. She wrote that she felt like a prisoner because she could not leave without losing her children and without facing social ruin, but that she was also a jailer because she supervised enslaved household workers and thus participated in their confinement, even though she did not choose the system and had limited power to change it. She wrote that the comfort of her life, including her fine clothes, her furnished house, and her freedom from physical labor, were built on the suffering of enslaved people, whose labor generated the wealth that sustained her comfort, while their bondage destroyed any possibility of her having genuine peace or happiness. She wrote that she had tried to convince herself that she was different from other plantation mistresses because she treated enslaved people kindly, and because she opposed slavery in principle, but that she now recognized such distinctions as meaningless because she still benefited from slavery and still participated in maintaining it regardless of her private moral objections. And she wrote that she felt morally responsible for slavery's violence, even though she had no power to end it, trapped in a position where accepting complicity felt like betraying her moral principles, but where resisting effectively would require sacrificing everything, including her children. Limitations of Northern anti-slavery sentiment when confronted with the practical and personal costs of actually challenging slavery. Catherine Chester wrote back expressing sympathy for Catherine's difficult position, but also advising her to make the best of her situation, to focus on raising her children well, and to accept that she could not change the larger system and should not sacrifice her own family's stability by attempting to do so. Catherine's father wrote urging her to remember her duty as a wife and mother, and warning that leaving Thomas or creating scandal by publicly criticizing slavery would destroy her reputation and would harm her children's futures. even friends who had expressed strong anti-slavery views before Catherine's marriage responded to her letter by suggesting that her duty was to stay in her marriage and to exercise whatever small influence she could, rather than attempting dramatic resistance that would likely fail and would definitely harm her personally. These responses reflected the reality that Northern anti-slavery sentiment was often shallow and was not accompanied by willingness to support individuals who would face real costs for resisting slavery, and they demonstrated how social and familial pressure reinforced women's subordination to husbands, even when those husbands were engaged in practices that everyone acknowledged were morally wrong. Catherine's survival strategy for the remaining years of her life involved a combination of continued small resistance, emotional withdrawal, and religious faith that promised eventual divine judgment on slavery, even if earthly justice was unavailable. She continued her limited interventions to help enslaved people when possible. She became increasingly withdrawn from Thomas and from social activities with other plantation families, spending much of her time alone reading religious texts and writing in journals that documented her thoughts and her struggles with moral questions that had no satisfactory answers. She focused on her children and on trying to maintain some sense of maternal authority and moral influence, even though she recognized that the plantation environment was teaching them values she found abhorrent. And she developed health problems that were probably partly psychosomatic responses to stress and moral distress, including chronic headaches, digestive issues, and periods of what would now be recognized as depression that left her unable to function normally for weeks at a time. These health problems became a form of passive resistance, allowing Catherine to withdraw from her duties as plantation mistress and to avoid participating in social rituals that required her to pretend that slavery was acceptable or that her life was happy. The Civil War, its arrival in 1861, created new dynamics that both vindicated Catherine's moral objections to slavery and created new forms of suffering as the world she had known collapsed. Thomas, who was a fervent Confederate. When Union forces reached Alabama in 1865 and slavery ended, Catherine felt both relief that the system she had opposed was finally destroyed, and anxiety about what emancipation would mean for her family's economic situation and for relationships with formerly enslaved people who might justifiably blame her for years of complicity, regardless of her private objections. Catherine attempted to maintain relationships with some formerly enslaved people after emancipation, offering to pay wages for continued domestic work, and expressing regret for not having done more to help them during slavery. But these attempts were generally rebuffed by people who did not want to continue working for the Hartley family and who did not find Catherine's expressions of regret meaningful given that she had participated in their enslavement for 30 years, regardless of whatever moral qualms she claimed to have felt. Thomas Hartley died in 1871, leaving Catherine widowed at age 58 and leaving her with control over remaining property and with the freedom she had. Catherine used this freedom to try to make some form of restitution for her years of complicity in slavery by supporting education initiatives for formerly enslaved people, by providing financial assistance to families she had known during slavery, and by writing a memoir that documented her experiences and that acknowledged her moral failures and complicity. The memoir was never published during Catherine's lifetime because family members objected that it would damage the Hartley name and would create scandal by acknowledging Thomas as sexual exploitation of enslaved women and by admitting Catherine's own moral struggles. but the manuscript survived in family papers and was eventually published in the 20th century, becoming an important source for historians studying plantation mistresses' experiences and studying how white women navigated complicity in slavery. Catherine died in 1889 at age 76, having lived long enough to see Reconstruction's promises betrayed and to see new systems of racial oppression emerge that perpetuated many of slavery's features under different legal frameworks. Her final years were characterized by continued attempts to use her resources to support Black education and economic development. By correspondence with some formerly enslaved people and their descendants who were willing to maintain contact despite the painful history, and by religious devotion that focused on themes of confession, repentance, and hope for forgiveness for sins that could never be fully atoned for through earthly actions. Catherine's will provided bequests to several formerly enslaved families and to Black churches and schools, small gestures that could not compensate for decades of complicity, but that represented her ongoing attempts to address moral debts that she recognized as unpayable. The historical significance of Catherine's story lies partly in what it reveals about the experiences and moral struggles of anti-slavery white women who became trapped in slave-holding marriages, and partly in what it demonstrates about the limitations of individual moral objection when confronting systematic evil. Catherine genuinely opposed slavery and genuinely tried to help enslaved people within her limited power. But these genuine feelings and limited actions did not prevent her from participating in and benefiting from slavery for 30 years. Her story demonstrates that good intentions and private moral objections were insufficient to absolve complicity when participation continued regardless of those objections, and that the system of slavery created moral impossibilities where all available choices involved some form of complicity or betrayal. But Catherine's story also demonstrates forms of resistance that were possible even within severe constraints, including small acts of kindness, documentation of truth for future generations, and use of resources after gaining freedom to attempt some form of restitution. Whether these forms of resistance should be seen as meaningful or as inadequate remains debated among historians. The comparison between Catherine's limited oppression as a woman without legal rights and enslaved people's absolute bondage reveals fundamental differences in power and vulnerability, even though both groups were subordinated to white men's authority. Catherine had no legal rights to property or to custody of her children, but she had social status, had freedom of movement, had protection from sale or physical abuse that was legally actionable, and had the possibility of eventual widowhood that would grant her autonomy. Enslaved people had none of these protections or possibilities. They were property who could be sold, beaten, or killed with minimal legal consequences, who had no recognized family bonds, and who had no realistic hope of freedom through any legal mechanism. Catherine's suffering was real, including her moral distress and her trapped position in a marriage she could not leave. But her suffering was incomparably less than what enslaved people endured, and her moral compromises were made from a position of relative privilege rather than from absolute powerlessness. Recognizing both that Catherine experienced genuine oppression and that her situation was fundamentally different from enslaved people's requires holding both truths simultaneously without collapsing the crucial differences in power and vulnerability. The legacy of white women like Catherine, who opposed slavery privately but participated in it, practically extends to ongoing questions about complicity, resistance, and moral responsibility in situations where individuals have limited power to change unjust systems. Catherine's story raises questions about whether private moral objection has any value if it does not lead to effective resistance, about what forms of resistance are possible for people with limited power, about whether small acts of kindness within unjust systems represent meaningful resistance or counterproductive collaboration that makes systems more tolerable, and about how to judge people who made moral compromises while living in circumstances where all available choices involve some form of wrongdoing. These questions remain relevant today as people continue to confront systematic injustices where they have limited individual power to create change, but where their participation and benefit from unjust systems create moral responsibilities that cannot be escaped through private disagreement or through small gestures that do not fundamentally challenge structures. What should we remember about Catherine Hartley and about her description of being trapped in her husband's house of slaves? That she was a Northern woman with anti-slavery views who married a slaveholder and discovered that the reality of plantation slavery contradicted all promises of humane treatment. That she tried small interventions to help enslaved people, but could not prevent fundamental cruelties, including family separations and sexual violence. That she had no legal rights to property or children, and could not leave the marriage without losing everything. That she felt trapped as both jailer and prisoner, supervising enslaved workers while having no power to free them or to fundamentally change their conditions. That her comfort depended on enslaved people's labor while their suffering destroyed her moral peace. That she recognized her own complicity even as she maintained private moral objections. That Northern family and friends advised her to accept her situation rather than supporting effective resistance. That she survived through small resistance, withdrawal, and faith while developing health problems from stress. That after Thomas's death, she attempted restitution through supporting formerly enslaved people, though such efforts could not compensate for decades of complicity. And that her story represents the moral impossibilities that slavery created for everyone who participated in it, including those who privately opposed it, but who lacked power to escape or to fundamentally challenge it. What do you think about Catherine's position as someone who opposed slavery, but who participated in it for 30 years? Do her private moral objections and small acts of kindness have any significance given her continued complicity? How should we judge white women who are themselves oppressed by patriarchy, but who benefited from racial oppression? What forms of resistance were possible for women in Catherine's position, and would more dramatic resistance have been morally required even if it meant losing her children? And what lessons does Catherine's story hold for thinking about moral responsibility in situations where individuals participate in unjust systems they have limited power to change? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If Catherine's story of being trapped in her husband's house of slaves challenged your understanding of plantation mistresses and demonstrated the complex moral terrain of complicity and limited resistance, hit subscribe for Epoch of Fear and smash the notification bell. We explore the moral compromises that slavery demanded from everyone, including those who privately opposed it. Share this with someone who needs to. Understand that opposing injustice privately while participating in it, practically, was a common pattern that raises difficult questions about complicity and resistance. Catherine was trapped, but she was also complicit. Remember both truths. Remember the impossible choices. Remember that slavery destroyed everyone it touched.